Thanks, Katie. Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone, to our panel on women and horror. And I am joined by four of my favorite authors, some who are new to me, some I've loved for a long time, but we have a lot to get to. So I will just say right now, Elisabeth Thomas, Alma Katsu, Danielle Trussoni, and Silvia Moreno-Garcia, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
It's just great. I am going to go through your biographies so our attendees and participants will know a little bit more about you, and then we'll get into some questions about your books. So without further ado, Danielle Trussoni is a New York Times, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author whose books have been translated into more than 30 languages, and that is kind of a big deal. She's written 5 books. Her latest, The Ancestor, was published this past April, and it was a New York Times Editor's Choice. She has been a jurist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction and writes the horror column for the New York Times Book Review. Danielle holds an MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she lives in the Hudson Valley of New York with her family. So glad to see you, Danny.
Nice
Next, we have, not on video, but on audio, Silvia Moreno-Garcia. She's the author of the novels Gods of Jade and Shadow, Certain Dark Things, Untamed Shore, and a bunch of other books. She has also edited several anthologies, including the World Fantasy Award winner, She Walks in Shadows, AKA Cthulhu's Daughters. And right now, Silvia has a new book out called Mexican Gothic that I had the honor of reviewing for the LA Times, and we have a lot to talk about with that one. Then next to Danielle is Alma Katsu, who is the author of The Deep. It's a reimagining of the story of the Titanic with a horror twist. She has also written The Taker, that was her debut, and The Hunger, The Reckoning. Let's see, The Taker, The Reckoning, and The Descent are a trilogy. The Hunger is about the Donner Party with a horror twist. And she has gotten all kinds of accolades and critical acclaim for her books. She lives outside of Washington, D.C. with her husband, the musician Bruce Katsu. And she's a graduate of the Johns Hopkins Writing Program in Brandeis, where she studied with John Irving. She's also an alumni of the Squaw Valley community of writers, and she has a very cool career. Before she published her first novel, she worked in intelligence with several agencies and a think tank, and she also works now as a consultant on emerging technologies. So, Alma, I am looking for the book that combines that work with horror, and it's got to be coming. And last but very much not least is the author of one of my favorite 2020 books, Elisabeth Thomas, who grew up in Brooklyn, New York. She still lives and now writes in Brooklyn. She graduated from Yale University. There's a family tie there, and currently works as an archivist for a modern art museum. Catherine House is her first novel, and we have tons to talk about with that one as well. So Elisabeth, Alma, Danielle, and Silvia, welcome. So
Thank you.
We've got so much to work on here. And as I was saying to all of you before we began, I hadn't thought of myself as a horror fan. And then your books came along. I have been reading Danny and Alma's books for years, and Silvia and Elisabeth's now for a much shorter time, but I can't wait for more. And now I have to read Gods of Jade and Shadow, of course, Silvia. And I realized it's not because I didn't like horror. It's because I've been reading male-centric horror. And that was what didn't appeal to me. When I started reading horror fiction and Gothic fiction written by women, I was completely in the swing. So why is the world, this is my first question to you all, why is the world just beginning to notice that women also write horror?
I can jump in. I have some thoughts about that.
Please.
Well, you know, I think that it's not that the world is just beginning to realize this. I think that they're realizing it again, because horror really, or the kind of horror that I love and that I read, really began with Mary Shelley and the Brontes and a lot of women writers. And it was, you know, it wasn't sort of segregated into a genre, really. It was just considered literature.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think, became lost in the 20th century to some extent. And we all think of, when we think horror, we think, I mean, not everybody, none of the people, here
Right.
probably, but many people out in the world think, oh, Clive Barker, or oh, Stephen King, or, this kind of slasher bloody, there's a final girl, all the women are dead, lying all over. A lot of sort of misogynistic tropes show up. And, people think that that's horror. And, in some ways, I guess it is in popular culture, but I would say that it originated really with women's imagination, women's bodies almost. There's, a really like deep connection between, for example, in Frankenstein, creation and horror and, and all of that strain of writing that makes it a very female form. What I'm thrilled about, and then I'll let someone else take over, is that it is turning back to this element of horror. And not only that, it's becoming more inclusive, and it's, movies, I always say this, films like Parasite or Get Out, really in another medium, obviously opened the door to horror in a way that people hadn't thought of it before as well. So it seems to me like it's really expanding.
Well, there's two, oh, sorry.
Yeah, please, go ahead, Silvia.
Well, there's probably two things that are working together. One is Joanna Russ wrote a whole book about this, which was called, an essay, How to Suppress Women's Writing, where she goes over 11 points of ways that we kind of remove women from the canon or don't allow them to be categorized in a certain way. But the other thing is that horror as a category ceased to exist in the early 1990s. There was a big implosion of horror, and what happened was that the Dell Abyss line collapsed, and horror as a category collapsed. That's why there's no horror section really anymore in bookstores the way it used to be. And there are really no large horror imprints until Tor decided to launch Nightfire, which was, I think, last year that they said that they were going to start up again. There hasn't been a big five kind of horror publishers. So what happened was that some people who were kind of emerging in that time period in the early 90s that were making a splash suddenly didn't have a category you couldn't sell anymore. So they moved into other things. Maybe they moved into fantasy or science fiction or even thrillers. So you had this movement of everybody, but it also obviously affected women especially. I think you found The Cipher had done pretty well. That was a horror novel. It was part of the Dell Abyss line. Poppy Said Bright had done really well, who is now called Billy Martin, but at the time was considered an important proponent of women in horror. And so there really was this huge shift. And when it's just like Westerns, right? You don't find Westerns in most bookstores nowadays. So if we were speaking about, great Western women, contemporary writers, we would have a really hard time. So that just has been one of the big problems, that there hasn't been a market really for it. And so also when you try to sell it to an editor, they'll tell you that there is no market. They'll say there's no market for horror, vampires are dead, urban fantasy doesn't sell anymore, nobody wants this or that or the other. And so if commercially it's not something that somebody wants to see, then you can't have a literary body if people are not interested in buying it and editors are not interested in seeing it.
That is so important.
That's my pick.
The business side of things. And Alma, I saw you nodding furiously when Silvia was talking about the, lack of the Western genre. And so because you've written about the West with The Hunger, this is something you must be dying to answer.
Well, it's interesting. When we were in the run-up to getting The Hunger published, both the publisher and other folks that I was speaking to at the time were very hopeful. You know, there were some, what we call Weird West, that sort of, you know, conflation of Westerns and fantasy, or, you know, those types of more speculative fiction aspects. Josh Malerman did Unbury Carol at the same time. We were kind of hoping for this, you know, a little resurgence of Westerns out there. You know, I was really happy to hear both Danielle and Silvia's takes, especially Silvia really, you know, giving us the history and putting things in context. I don't really consider myself like a canonical horror person by any stretch, but I know some of the background, mostly just because I'm old and I lived through it. I remember when horror was popular and then it went away for a while. And I would say, just in my observation, it seems like we're kind of going through a little resurgence of horror right now. And it's certainly broadening. You know, I was really lucky with The Hunger. It did well. And so I was started to be asked to blurb a lot of books. And the books they were sending me were books that probably most people wouldn't think of as horror. But I think if you go by the Horror Writer Association's definition, horror isn't a genre, it's a feeling. And so there's a lot of things that can evoke the feeling of horror. And so we're seeing a lot of novels that are kind of in the psychological suspense category, but bring in or hint at horror, some very lightly, some actually do make it a question of whether or not the horror is being caused by a supernatural element or something like that. You just see all kinds of books now that have that horror element to it. And I think partly it's because, you know, with the, has to do with television, with all the streaming that's going on and the huge appetite for content. And so much of the content out there on streaming services is horror. You know, people were, especially in America, we're sort of raised on horror. You know, we watch horror movies, especially from when we're very young, and it teaches us, to like that. And maybe now the literature will be able to catch up, will be allowed to catch up with the desire that's already out there.
Well, Lizzie, I want to hear from you first, but then I want to also make sure that I tie in something about what I saw a few years ago that led me to bring you on the panel with Catherine House, even though it might not be precisely horror, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let me hear about you as a debut novelist and a younger writer, what you think about this.
I think what the other panelists have said all makes complete sense to me. I think that most writers, when they go into a project, are not thinking necessarily how the book will be marketed, because you're a writer, you're not a marketer. You may daydream about it and think you see as like your contemporaries and things like that, but you're not thinking like these are the exact sentences that they're going to use to pitch this, and these are the, or you may dream about that and you'll be completely wrong. So I think that you kind of, or perhaps hopefully you're kind of thinking of what story you want to tell, what story you need to tell, what feels natural for you to tell. And then, it goes into the machine of the publishers learning how to market it and publish it and have it find the audience that the book wants. And that's when it gets a label like horror or thriller, suspense, or whatever. And those definitions I found with Catherine House, that they, those can kind of be massaged depending on who they're kind of trying to reach out to. Because, a lot of it, it's not like, there can be, a different book can have a different effect with a different reader. And something that's a horror book for one reader may be a thriller for another reader, or whatever. And I think that, marketers basically take advantage of that, which is good, as they should, because we want the stories to have as many wonderful readers as they can.
Absolutely. And this is why I'll tell you my little take, and then I would like each one of you to tell us a little bit about your book. I deliberately waited to have you describe your books until we talked a bit more about this resurgence. And I noticed, I do mystery and thriller reviews for NPR books, and I get all kinds of stuff that's to my taste and not to my taste. And I'm amazed at the range, but I'm also amazed at how much there is of the domestic psychological drama. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are some that are incredibly good and some that have really captured the public imagination, like The Girl on the Train or The Woman in the Window. But a lot of them are really pedestrian. And then a few years back, I can't remember when it was, from Pegasus, who does some interesting stuff, I started getting these books by F.R. Tallis, who is really named Frank Tallis. And Frank Tallis, I believe, is a psychiatrist by training and profession, but writes mysteries and thrillers. And these were the reason they captured me, some of you know I write a lot about depression. I'm writing a memoir about depression. One was called The Sleep Room. And I don't know, have you read that, Alma?
I reviewed it for Publishers Weekly, actually.
An amazing book. And
it was very good.
It was very good because what it did, and this is where the resurgence came for me, is it showed mental illness as a form of horror. And we all know other books, and of course, The Yellow Wallpaper, Bow Down to Our Foremother, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. But that's what I saw in Catherine House. I saw in Catherine House that there was horror that was all over the place in the atmosphere. It's kind of like the adaptation of Lev Grossman's The Magicians, even though that gets, I have my own opinions on the production, the adaptation, but the atmosphere is so important. The feeling is so important. And so each of your novels, and in the case of some of you, several novels, has really appealed to me on that emotional level. So with that, I would like to ask you, Lizzie, Alma, Silvia, Danielle, tell us a little bit about your latest book, about your new book, and where it fits into this spectrum of horror.
Sure. Want to start with me? Since
yes, please.
Sure. So, I have a copy here. Catherine House.
Hold it up.
We got them all over the place, so. So Catherine House, it's a story of a young woman who goes to this cult-like college and finds out that this elite school that kind of promises its students everything may be actually up to some mysterious scientific experiments that are maybe perhaps a little supernatural, a little horrific. We'll see. I love what you said about that something that's horrible about it, so, inducing of horror, is this sense of mental illness, because in my mind, a lot of it is actually kind of a portrait of depression and a kind of portrait of this particularly late 20s, early 20s kind of numbness. And I really wanted that, I almost wanted to create a literalization of that into what the things that then later in the plot line become what makes it supernatural and what makes it horrible. I wanted to be related to an actual very real feeling of depression and dissociation from the world. Mm-hmm. And so the thing that makes me happiest is when people say that there was something eerie about it, or that there was something kind of numbing, or kind of just that kind of weird feeling on the back of your neck. That is absolutely what I want to go for. So that makes me feel.
You did it, lady. You did it.
Thank you so much. I love that.
Wonderful. Alma, how about you with The Deep?
Sure. First of all, I have to say, though, now I have to read that book. It just sounds fabulous. And I know it's been getting like rave reviews everywhere. So congratulations on that.
Yeah.
The Deep. So this book is another of my historical reimaginings with a horror twist. And it has to do with the sinking of the Titanic and also its sister ship, the Britannic. And, it's very reflective of the time, which was the end of the Gilded Age. And so, it's a little bit maybe more romantic. It's certainly Gothic. And I know we're going to talk a lot about what is Gothic, so I'll save that for that time. But at the heart of it is that you don't know, is the narrator, one of the narrators, it's got an ensemble cast, but the main character, is what she's talking about with the ghosts and the mysterious happenings actually happening, or is it in her mind? I won't be giving anything away because it happens right in the beginning, where you find out that she's been in an asylum for 4 years, but you don't know exactly why she's there, or why she was there for 4 years, or what her situation is. And so some readers have said they've really enjoyed that in the book, it creates that the disbelief. You just don't know what's going on. and coupled with the supernatural element, I think. One of the things I also tried to sort of channel a little bit was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, where you have this main character and you're not exactly sure, she's not exactly sure of all of the things that are going on around her. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you. Silvia, how about you? Mexican Gothic.
Yeah, I really liked a review from The Guardian that said that Mexican Gothic is Lovecraft meets the Brontes in Latin America. And after a slow burn start, Mexican Gothic gets seriously weird. Oh, thank you. There we have it. Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
That's the book.
Coming in as well.
It is such a gorgeous cover, Silvia.
Oh, there we go. I'll hold it like
Yeah, no, I love the cover. The other thing that it has, it does have several historical and real elements in it.
Yes.
One of them is eugenics. So, you know, the old racialized scientific ideas are embedded into the narrative. And it also addresses issues of colonialism within completely a Gothic framework, because the title is not a lie. It is exactly
no, it's not.
Gothic.
It really is, and it's just, you know, it's just amazing. We'll talk more about the eugenics in a few minutes, because I did have a question for you and Danny about that issue in your books. But Danielle, first, please tell us a little bit about the Ancestor.
Sure. So first of all, I also want to say I've read all three of their books, The Deep, Mexican Gothic, and Catherine House, and I love all of them. So I'm really happy to be here with you guys. But so this is the Ancestor, and it is, I guess it's a Gothic, you know, it's a Gothic novel. It's set in the contemporary world. A woman takes a DNA test and discovers she has a family that she didn't know about in the Italian Alps. And she goes to check it out, and she gets trapped in this large estate in a very remote part of the Alps. And things get very scary from that point on.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they do. And there's so many elements in it, and different kinds of horror, which is also something I appreciated in this one, and made me start thinking of angelology in a new light. Because when I first read angelology, I don't know if it was because of the marketing, Danny, or because of the time, or because of other things I was reading. You know, I thought of it more as this, oh, I don't know, there's magic and supernatural, but I didn't like key in to the fact that it's really horror. You know, there are really some horrific things happening there. And again, it's interesting because we're talking about something that is based more on feeling than on setting. There's so many different settings. That's the great thing about the way you guys are writing. You can use historical settings, you can use contemporary settings, you can use a college with Gothic buildings, you can use a crumbling family mansion, and so on and so forth. So each of your novels actually contains elements of the Gothic, because the Gothic is about what? Is it about a feeling? Is it about a look and feel? What does Gothic mean? And anyone can jump in.
Well, one thing I'll chime in. I mean, I do think that there's, in some ways, Gothic is a very personal thing. It means certain things to certain people. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, when I was very young, I was almost what you would consider a goth. I was really into Gothic music and all that. So I can say it's a look, but in, you know, I've had to answer this question with the last few books, especially with The Deep. And so, you know, in my research into it, one of the explanations that I really liked is that what marks a Gothic is that it's about the transition of a normal person from the everyday world into understanding that there is more to this world than what we can see. It's like the veil gets lifted from their eyes, and suddenly they see that there's usually, you know, this sort of maybe supernatural or otherworldly, you know, element to it. And if you think of your favorite Gothics, you know, and think about it, that's usually what it is. It's that journey of an individual into what often seems like madness or something like that, right? Because but it's them being led to understand really that this is the real truth and not the world that that we thought we knew.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. That makes total sense to me. I think it's different even than, you can't just say even that it's necessarily something that already has elements of the supernatural in it. I think I agree that it's kind of like I would describe it, yes, as a mood, a feeling, and it's kind of that feeling of destabilization, of going from a character or a world being completely understood, and then kind of realizing over the course of a story that something is off kilter, and that there's something, and not that just that there's something off kilter, but that there's something off kilter that is kind of maybe somehow beyond human comprehension or human reason or human control, that it's something that's greater than our understanding. And I think that sense of something being out of our control is what really makes it very frightening.
Mm.
So
yeah, please.
From an academic perspective, Gothic is kind of a child or perhaps a cousin of Romanticism. It's it develops in an offshoot of that. It is a very broad category, defined probably by its heightened emotions. And I say it's very broad because Gothic academians normally have traditionally divided Gothic into what they call the male Gothic and the female Gothic. The male Gothic is more violent and has supernatural elements. That would be something like the monk. And the female Gothic doesn't have supernatural elements, and it has more of a romantic element. And that would be, the perfect example is Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. And that's why people get confused sometimes. And
I think we've lost
read something like Dracula, and they might say, well, that's Gothic and Wuthering Heights is not. And then it's because this genre encompasses these two kind of poles, which still have elements in common, but they don't work exactly the same way. That's how something like Phantom of the Opera and Edgar Allan Poe can coexist in a similar space as Rebecca. And which really, has some points in common, but in other ways it's very different. And I think one of the issues that sometimes happens with modern audiences is if they're not too familiar with this genre, they can dismiss other ways of, for example, they might think, well, Gothic always has to have a supernatural element. It can't just be about explorations of madness, but that is not true. Right? And the other way around is the same thing. So it's this very broad category. And because it has a very long history, it has also changed and evolved throughout time. So the mid-20th century Gothics, which are very romantic, those were all the paperbacks that came out in the 60s and the 70s with the covers of women running away from castles. Those very much are kind of like pre-Harlequins. They precede the modern romance novel. They have more in common with that than, say, the monk. So if you're just coming into it and you don't know too much about it, you might be very dismissive of some of the offshoots of this genre without realizing that they're perfectly valid. That's something that is more like Catherine House can actually, sit next to something that, is maybe more like the Deep, right? They're not fighting with each other.
Exactly. Love that. And I'm so glad that you're able to give more of an academic perspective, Silvia. That's great. Danny, how about you?
Well,
I know you have thoughts.
I do have thoughts, but I want to say that I want the paperback of The Ancestor to be a woman running away from a castle. All right, I'm going right now, and I'm going to send an email to the marketing people. Because actually it's so interesting. Of course I've seen those covers and I just didn't, and of course I know they're Gothic, but that's just not how I think of Gothic at all. So when I was writing Angelology, for example, which is my first book, which is in retrospect, as you say, was maybe marketed the wrong way because it is very Gothic. It's all about religion and secrets in religion and nuns and, sexual relationships between humans and angels. It's like very dark. And
yes.
I think they were trying to sell it as Dan Brown, honestly. And so they called it a thriller and they called it a puzzle and all this stuff. And that's really not what it was. But anyway, when I, wrote that book and when I wrote The Ancestor, just from a craftsman's sort of point of view, the way that I think of it is from the interior of spaces. And I think something that I love about the Gothic is it's about the buildings. It's about the sort of nostalgia for crumbling, 18th century estates and homes. And, if you look at, sort of what Gothic was I think it's in the 18th or 19th century, when people were writing Gothic, it really was about nostalgia in some ways.
Yes.
And this sort of longing for this totally imaginary past.
The Castle of Otranto, for example.
Right, exactly. And so, for me, just as a writer, it starts with a Gothic setting, and everything kind of bubbles up and emerges from place and setting, and then the characters. So I don't know, Gothic for me, really, there are, many signposts and different ways of writing Gothic fiction, I think. But for me, it really does start with a feeling of what it would be like to be in that space.
That's so interesting, because we have such different spaces that we're talking about. Again, we're talking about a contemporary university that has Gothic elements, perhaps, Lizzie. And then we're talking about the hortus conclusus, the closed garden of a luxury liner, Alma. Silvia, we're talking about not just a crazy Anglo mansion, but a town, which we'll get to more in a second. And then, of course, Danny, for you, it's this immense mountain-bound family mansion that really is all the things that you were talking about. And so place doesn't necessarily have to look 18th century, but it does have to have some kind of menace and foreboding. That's what Gothic really feels like to me. Is that something anyone would want to comment on?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think, because, I think that the menace is absolutely essential, right? I mean, yes. I think that that's the defining feeling when Alma was mentioning that the Horror Writers Association defines horror as a sensation or a feeling. I completely agree, because it's such a multifarious genre, right? It can go anywhere as long as it has that menace and this feeling of foreboding. So, the locations, they're all different in these books, true. But I think that all of them are quite scary in their own way, which is wonderful, right? I mean, I also just want to say something. I don't know if you mentioned it at the beginning when you were introducing this about horror, but, I also think that we've come back to horror in a way, partially because our world has become so ramped up with emotion and contradictory emotions, that horror is one of the few genres that make you feel. Right, it is. I think Silvia said there was, in this kind of horror and Gothic fiction in particular, a kind of emotional melodrama. And I'm not saying that our books are melodramatic, but I'm saying that it does tap into emotion in a way that people are hungry for, and it just sort of matches the world in some ways right now.
It really does, and I want to ask Silvia a question. I'm fascinated, and you just posted a picture on Twitter of Real de Monte. I'm not sure if I'm saying that town correctly, the English town in which Mexican Gothic is set. And so I wanted to talk about why that setting is crucial to a book that's titled Mexican Gothic. So is it Real de Montes, Real de Monte? Do we have Silvia?
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I have a terrible internet connection.
Oh, no,
I'm not doing video, but yeah, no, it's Real del Monte. And like Danielle was mentioning about the importance of setting, in her case in the Alps, in my case it's in Mexico. So Real del Monte, which inspires my novel, is a real town. It's located in central Mexico in the state of Hidalgo. It was a mining town. That area is a big mining area. First, it was mined by the Spanish, and then in the 1800s, it was mined by the British. It has a very particular look and feel due to that. It has an English cemetery, like in my novel, where all the gravestones are lined towards England. And that area was also the site of a huge mining accident, El Bordo mining accident, which Judy Herrera relates in the nonfiction book Silent Fury, which came out at the same time as mine, same month, just out of coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a nonfiction account of an accident at El Bordo mine in that same area. More than 80 miners died. They were basically burnt alive. Oh. And they threw their corpses into a gigantic unmarked grave. So that's what they did with that. So why did I set it in an English town in the middle of Mexico instead of, say, in an hacienda in Guadalajara or in Yucatan or in another part of Mexico if it's called Mexican Gothic? And well, it's because, for one, it allowed me to invert the idea of the other, which appears in Gothic literature. And what we have in the Gothic literature often is that the other, the foreign, is dangerous or tainted. In Dracula is coming from Eastern Europe, and he is a vector of disease who is also menacing the women, the white women in London and in this part of the world. In Dragonwyck, we have a mixed race woman who is, quote unquote, crazy lady, crazy Caribbean lady. She spouts prophetic statements and just, acts the part of the woo, that crazy lady. And then we have, of course, in Jane Eyre, we have a mad woman in the attic, literally. I mean, she's a white woman, but there's this idea in literature and also in eugenics that once a white person goes into something like the Caribbean, they become compromised. Their whiteness is kind of decreased. They become more savage. So the wife in this sense is kind of like this compromised womanhood, this compromised whiteness that has been tainted. And so in all these examples, the people of color are made to be the other, the dangerous element. And I wanted to write a book in which you have a woman of color, and she's not the other. She's not the dangerous element. She's actually meeting with the other, with the horrific. And it also allowed me to explore ideas and issues about colonialism that I couldn't have explored if I had set this in a different kind of context. I could have written a Gothic novel, but it would have been a different Gothic novel. And there's also something cheeky about the title, because oftentimes Latin American writers, we're only allowed to write magic realism. That's the one category that we are allowed to write. So there was a kind of a kind of like, well, see, I can also write something else. You are not going to be able to classify this as magic realism if it says Gothic on the cover, though people still try very hard.
I love that so much, Silvia, just because I want to say one thing, is that Noemi, the protagonist, not only is the voice of reason, but she's also the glamorous one. We see so much costume drama in this country that is Anglo, Downton, or Mad Men and Betty Draper. And to see this young woman in Mexico who is glamorous, sophisticated, but still very much a Mexican, an educated, really worldly young woman. It was just, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And I know she's not the only one, but it was wonderful to read her, Silvia. So thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. I like how she gets really spunky at the end too. She's glamorous and she's looking really good, but she's going for it at the end.
Oh, she really is going for it at the end. Alma, there are so many versions of the Titanic story. What drew you to it? What did you think would be new? And I liked, similarly to what Silvia was just saying about, telling something that approached and looked at colonialism, that wasn't just the same old magical realism trope. In looking at the Titanic, you're looking at it from a different perspective, not the same one that has been approached before. So when did you decide that was a story you wanted to take on, and how did you decide on your angle?
So it was interesting. After The Hunger, as I had mentioned, we were so lucky, the book did very well.
Yes.
And then the questions start. well, what next disaster are you going to write about? And there I was thinking, okay, I'm going to be the Irwin Allen of disaster novels in the 21st century. And so, you know, why not go for one of the biggies? So the idea actually came from my husband was watching a documentary one day, and it was about the sinking of the Britannic, the sister ship. And I was like, I didn't even know there was a sister ship to the Titanic. And then the announcer said, and there was a woman who survived both sinkings. And I didn't even have to know her story. I knew that that was a great kernel for a story. So that's actually where it came from. More the sort of storyteller's instinct, right? What's going to make a good dramatic story? But, you know, I've always been interested in the Gilded Age. It was on one hand, a very glamorous time, but then when you really look at the things that are happening in society at the time, it's an important time to look at, and in so many ways mirrors what we're going through right now. I mean, the two biggest issues of the day were women's rights, and when I started this story, it was when there was so much, you know, all women's reproductive rights are under attack again, something that I thought had been, you know, nailed down decades ago. And the other one is income disparity. Just, you know, this is the age that gave us the term robber barons. And if you don't think that that applies today, you are not paying attention. So it was an opportunity to write a book that was at once historical, but again, just like with the hunger, kind of showed that unfortunately, you know, history does not exactly repeat itself. It's like we can't get away from it in certain respects, and we haven't solved things. It's still haunting us, the same problems. Well, and it was fun to write something so so romantic and kind of glitzy in a way too. You know, that's not what I normally do.
No, it isn't. But you know, I mentioned to you before when we were talking, you know, over email, that a couple of years ago, my husband and I went to Ireland and went to the Belfast docks, where they have this amazing Titanic museum. And I have a point in telling the story, I promise. I had not been interested in the Titanic at all, couldn't care less. Every time a documentary came on, I'd be like, why are people so fascinated, blah, blah, blah. So we go to this museum, and it's very well done. I absolutely encourage anyone who has the chance to go and see it. It's fascinating. And one of the reasons it's fascinating is they have these 3 reconstructions of the different kinds of cabins.
Oh.
And what got to me about that was, of course, you have the first class cabin, and that is just perfect. And then you have the third class cabin, and that is very bare and spare and sad. But it was the one that they've reconstructed is the cabin of one of the men who played in the orchestra, you know, on the deck. And I was a violinist for a long time in high school and college. And so he was a violinist, and there was his fiddle. There was his case.
Wallace Hartley's fiddle, yes.
Yes, yes. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is a direct, like, soul kind of connection. And it made me realize just what you were saying, Alma, that there's so much in this about income and class and humanity. And the thing about horror is that it allows you to transcend some of those boundaries, as Silvia was just talking about. It allows you to have feelings for characters who are so different from you. And so with that, I want to go to Danielle, because I want to talk, and I want you, and Lizzie, I'm going to come back to you too, but I want to talk about this genetics and heredity element, without any spoilers, that you and Silvia share in your books, because the real horror in the Ancestor, it's not just coming from inside the house, it's coming from inside the body.
Right. I mean, that's the ultimate discovery that this young woman makes.
Right.
Is that, you know, her ancestors have horrific, well, actually, the thing is.
No, they're not horrific.
They're not
right.
horrific. I would say that she, in the experience of discovering it, would find it horrific. I, you know, as the writer, actually find her discovery to be quite noble. you know, and the people she's descended from, you know, I actually love them.
Yes.
So, you know, I wouldn't say they're horrific, but I think that the journey is not so much going someplace and, oh my God, it's scary, and I'm confronted with scary elements and people who are going to try to kill me, so much as her coming to terms with what it means to be who she is.
Exactly. It's identity. It really is that deep, you know, connection. That's an amazing thing. And you're right. Who she is actually so lovely. So
cute. Although it's scary how she gets there, but
it is.
You know, when I was writing this, the research I did would not be what you would normally think of as researching a horror novel. I suppose a little bit like Alma with her books, right? You know, I was researching the history of hominids and mankind and evolutionary theory. And
don't give anything away.
I'm sorry, I won't give any more than that. But very, very sciencey, right? Like, it was very, like, I went to you know, Paris to see a hominid exhibit that was like a whole museum of all the information they had about Neanderthals. Wow. And, you know, and it was fascinating. They had reconstructed these people, and they had discovered that their vocal cords actually were swollen in the ones that the mummified Neanderthals that they found. And so they had language, right? Like, it's just fascinating. So all of that went into basically a plot that revolves around, like Silvia's plot, revolves around eugenics and genetics and DNA and what that means when, you know, you're sort of going through generations.
Well, and I'm going to take that. There's so much more to say about that, but I want to take that to you, Lizzie, for a minute, because speaking about eugenics and heredity and generations, one of the reasons that you decided to write Catherine House as a Yale University graduate is that your grandfather had gone to Yale and did not have a good experience, which is not surprising.
Yeah, no, my grandfather went there, and his son, my dad, also went there. So I'm technically I guess call it a double legacy or whatever, but
third generation Eli.
Or both of your, anyway, whatever. But yeah, but it always so funny because it sounds very much like, you know, oh, my grandfather went to Yale and his son, but it's like, but it was just almost a running joke growing up that, yeah, my grandfather had an awful experience at Yale, and then so did his son, my dad, for different reasons. When my grandfather went there, he was, I think, class of 54 or something like that. And he was a Black man, obviously. And then I guess that's not obvious, but anyway, at that time they had a quota of maximum 3 Black people per year. I was trying, when I was like looking into this recently, I was trying to find some like evidence of this. And of course they did not put it in writing, but it was a quota. So yeah, so he was one of the 3 Black men in his year. And I mean, you can imagine being at an institution like Yale in the 50s as a Black man. It was not a great experience. So it was just interesting. It's just something that has been a running interest in my life, that there's just this tension between, to say that, you know, that there's so much connected just to the word of Yale, just sounds so elite and sounds so precious and so respected, and that in my family, I just think of it as an institution that has hurt my family. And then, yeah, and that his son went there as well, and he also had a bad experience there for more 70s type reasons as opposed to 50s type reasons. But
because exclusivity for so long at places like Yale meant exclusion.
Mm-hmm, exactly. It meant exclusion, and it means kind of like, we'll give you, they'll let you in, but we're letting in 3 Black men per class. So, you know, it's kind of like, it's kind of, you know, we're giving you a crumb to make it all the more precious. And it's just, I think there's so much about it that's so poisonous. But I was so interested in that idea, and it's just something that I've always grown up with, you know, like when my parents would get, you know, the letters that they send asking for donations, they laugh and we're like, where are we going to put this? And like, you know, and just throw it right in the trash. So it is just so funny to think then that I ended up there almost like by coincidence, because they had I majored in art history. They had a great art history program. It was a distance from home, and there was various practical reasons for going there. But then I went there, and then I started at the school, and there were so many people who were so enamored of it, and who before I even having gone there, it's like, I'm going to go to Yale, and it's just so excited to be there for the. And I was kind of there, kind of in spite of the name. And so I just thought that was such an interesting tension, and that I clearly had some emotional issues to work out with this school.
Well, no, but the tension is absolutely right. And I know we're at about 6:21 and we have fewer than 10 minutes left. And there are so many more questions I want to ask you all, but I also want to make sure that we have time for questions. And we do have one right now. So let's get to that. And then we can continue chatting, or we can build off of the question. Jason Henderson asks, totally curious why the collapse of horror you guys mentioned happened. Like, how can everyone be reading Poppy Bright and then suddenly stop? Also, I love the women running from houses books, and the Ancestor would definitely fit. So thanks, Jason, for that question. So maybe Silvia, that is a good one for you to take, since you were talking about this, history of what happened in the 80s and 90s with horror.
Yeah, one of the things that two things happened at once. One was that there was an oversaturation of the genre. So too many books that were very similar and that started to become very low quality, published during a short amount of time. Basically, everybody's trying to rip off Stephen King. Right. And so then, you lose quality and originality. And the other big thing that happened was that there was a shift. We had a lot of supernatural horror. Like I said, Stephen King was big, Dean Koontz, some other people were making it big. Peter Straub had Ghost Story. And then in the 90s, we had a shift towards what I would call thrillers, psychological thrillers. We've got The Silence of the Lambs in that time period. We've got serial killers becoming much more popular as a topic of interest. And so when that shift happens, readership seems to move from what we seem to consider, traditionally horror, to these kind of police procedural kind of situations, and that had a huge growth that later on will lead to things like the Da Vinci Code and that kind of work, where you've got some element that if that book had been done in the 1980s, it might have been marketed as a supernatural horror novel, because it has all these religious elements, it has a puzzle. Some elements might have been more emphasized and others de-emphasized, but surely it wouldn't have come up in the type of packaging that it came out later on. So I think those two things happened at the same time. And the collapse of the Dell Abyss line really was huge. That just left like a huge crater in the industry, and the industry has basically never been able to recover. There's been only tiny publishing presses, micro presses, people self-publishing, doing that kind of stuff for years and years, because nobody has wanted to kind of put money into that, except now Tor with Nightfire is actually going into this market space that might. Yeah, that's my bit.
Thank you. It's interesting because in the book review panel earlier, I was talking with my colleagues about